Okay, hello everyone. This is a foundational documents lecture that I'm going to be giving. Um, we are going to be having a quiz coming up soon on the foundational documents, and it will largely be based off of this lecture. So I would encourage you guys to take notes on this lecture. When the quiz does come around, I will allow you to use notes for your lecture. So this lecture and the notes that you take with it can be really helpful to you when we do come over the quiz. So the first thing I'm going to do is play a crash course video for you guys, and this is going to be an introduction, and we'll cover a lot of what is in this, what is covered in this video in a little bit more detail. If it will allow me to play.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Stan? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other country stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Stan. No, Stan, not the Libertage. Cue the intro. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. All right, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In two words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation: Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course World History fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must, and the Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through treaties signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs, but because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, in fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, I mean, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and Senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Yes, I know, you have fantastic elections in Canada. Yeah, right, okay, all that too. I get it. Okay, it's U.S. history, Thought Bubble. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a 2-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. New Jersey. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us 2 houses. A House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though, of course, they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious 3/5 compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons, the word slave was never used, would be the basis for the calculation. So, yeah, that's still in the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a fugitive slave clause requiring any escaped slave to be returned to their master. And this meant that a slave couldn't escape slavery by moving to a state where slavery was outlawed, which meant that on some level, some states couldn't enforce their own laws. Spoiler alert, this becomes problematic. But except for the tyranny of slavery, the framers really hated tyranny. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced 2 principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise. You can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state governments. As an American, I am a citizen both of the United States States and of the state of Indiana. And the national government, the one set up by the Constitution, is supposed to be limited in scope to certain enumerated powers. Most other powers, especially the protection of health, safety, and morals, are left to the states. But the Constitution also seeks to protect against the radicalism that too much democracy can bring. The mostly rich framers worried that the people, many of whom were poor and indebted, might vote in congresspeople or, God forbid, a president in favor of, redistribution of property. To hedge against this, senators were elected by the states, usually by state legislatures, and they were supposed to be leading citizen types. You know, the kind of good Americans who take bribes and have adulterous affairs in airport bathrooms and patronize prostitutes and shoot Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, the other hedge against too much democracy is the aforementioned Electoral College, which many Americans hate because it has the potential to elect a president who did not win the popular vote. But that's kind of the point. The electors were supposed to be prominent, educated men of property who were better able to elect a president than, the rabble. But the Constitution of the United States is a really impressive document, especially when you consider its longevity. I mean, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, the nation-state is pretty new on the historical scene, and the United States established by the Constitution is actually one of the oldest ones. But the Constitution would be meaningless if it hadn't been ratified, which it was, but not without a fight that helped clarify America's political ideology. 9 out of the 13 states were required to ratify the Constitution, and special conventions called for the purpose. In order to convince the delegates to vote for it, 3 of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays that together are known as the Federalist Papers. Taken together, they're a powerful and ultimately persuasive argument for why a strong national government is necessary and ultimately not a threat to people's liberty. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I name the author of the mystery document, shock as in surprise. If I don't, shock as in... All right, Stan, let's see what we got here. If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it, if it should exist. Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton. Yes! Too easy, Stan, although I appreciate the opportunity for a rant. The whole idea of the Second Amendment was that the people could protect themselves from a standing army by being equally well armed, which these days would mean not that citizens should have the right to buy assault rifles, but that they should have the right to buy, unmanned drones and arguably suitcase nukes. And by the way, in the Constitution, this is not listed as a privilege, it is listed as a right. And as a right, if I can't afford my own Predator drone, I guess the government should buy one for me. It's almost as if Alexander Hamilton had no way of knowing that weaponry would one day advance past the musket. Yes, you know how Alexander Hamilton died? Gunshot! Sorry, I had to. I am on a roll. So it would be easy to ignore the people who opposed the Constitution because, they lost. But some of the ideas of these so-called anti-federalists were particularly powerful, and they deserve a bit of attention. Anti-federalists, unlike the mostly wealthy federalists, were usually supported by common people, small farmers who weren't as involved in commercial activity. They saw less need for a strong national government that would foster trade and protect creditors. And the anti-federalists were very afraid of a strong government, especially one dominated by the wealthy. Writers like James Winthrop held that a large group of United States would be like an empire, and that no extensive empire can be governed upon republican principles. As evidence, he could point to Britain, or all the way back to Rome. Smaller, more local governments are more responsive to the people and better able to protect their rights. To the anti-federalists, that meant state government. And while ultimately the Federalists won out and the Constitution was ratified, the issue of how large government should be did not go away. So the Constitution was really only a starting point. It's a vague document, and the details would be worked out in the political process, and then on the battlefield. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is...
So the first foundational document that we are going to go over, and you guys have already done a short assignment on this, is the Declaration of Independence. So with the Declaration of Independence, what it really deals with is it's this statement from the colonists as to what they believe the government should be like and what the purpose of that government is. It has nothing to do with the structure of government. It has more to do with what they believe the purpose of the government is. And it's based off of the political thinking of this English political philosopher named John Locke. And so John Locke came up with something called the social contract theory. And essentially what he espouses in his writing is that the purpose of the government is to protect these inalienable rights, as he refers to them as, or these natural rights that all men have. And so among those are life, liberty, and he wrote property in his writing. In the Declaration of Independence, it lists life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it also deals with where government derives their authority from. And so, according once again to John Locke's writing, the government gets their authority from popular sovereignty. What that means is it gets its authority from the consent of the governed. So a government is only legitimate if it has the consent of the governed and if the government is working in a way that it is supposed to. And John Locke would go on and say, it's not only do individuals or do people have a right to overthrow their government if the government becomes destructive of what it is supposed to enforce and uphold, but they have a duty to do so. And so this is what we see in the Declaration of Independence. It has 5 sections to it. The preamble really sets the stage for showing how the British government is no longer legitimate. That's where you see this statement: when in the course of human events, one people find it necessary to dissolve the political bands which attach them to another. That's essentially laying the groundwork for explaining how the British government is no longer legitimate because it is not upholding the rights. And so, according to this political philosophy that the colonists have adopted, they now have the right to form their own government. So the 5 sections are the preamble, and then there's a statement of human rights. Then it goes into charges against the human rights, and then it goes to charges against the king and parliament, essentially how the king and how parliament have abused the rights of government and how it is no longer upholding the duty of government. And then finally at the end, it's a statement of separation, essentially saying we are no longer a part of the political entity that is Great Britain. And from here on out, we are going to form our own political government. So after the Declaration of Independence, the next foundational document actually deals with the structure of government, now that we know what the purpose of government is. And the structure of the articles, kind of like John Green talked about in his videos, it made the central government incredibly weak, so that it really couldn't do much. It could do a few things, but other than that, it could not do much. And this would eventually lead to quite a few political and economic problems. So under the Articles of Confederation, the states held supreme power. So states were given more power than the federal government. And this was done intentionally so. It was intentionally created, the Articles intentionally created a weak central government. And so really, at the inception of our country, after we win independence militarily from Britain, instead of one United States of America, kind of what we have today, under a strong federal government, we really had more 13 individual countries or 13 individual states that were not really acting in unison with each other. So according to the Articles of Confederation, instead of having what we do today, where we have a House of Representatives and a Senate, which is referred to as a bicameral legislature, we had a unicameral chamber. So we only had one chamber of Congress. And the way representation worked was equal representation. So it worked the way that the Senate works. Regardless of what size the state is, everybody would get one vote. So under the Articles, Congress, this is basically what they had the authority to do. So they could declare war, they could negotiate treaties, they could appoint tribunals for crimes of the sea, they could create a post office, and they could appoint a president of the Congress. But for the most part, that was really it. So it really could not do much. And so it didn't take long for these, what's referred to as the weaknesses of the Articles, to come about, and to it wouldn't be long until we realized what the problems were and how they would arise. And so the weaknesses of the Articles, the most blatant weakness of the Articles of Confederation was that Congress could not levy or collect taxes. So they had absolutely no way of raising their own revenue. The way that the Congress had to raise their revenue, if they wanted to get money for anything, was they essentially had to ask the states for money. And the states almost always would say no, because the states had their own debts. And so the federal government really had no way of collecting money. foreign governments didn't want to issue loans to the United States federal government because they didn't have a way to repay those loans because they didn't have a way to raise money. So this was a really severe economic issue. To change an amendment in the Articles required all 13 states to agree. And as you guys probably are well aware, in politics, it is very, very difficult to get 13 people to agree on anything, let alone 13 states. And so, like I mentioned in the video, no amendments were ever changed in the Articles of Confederation. They never added an amendment like that because it was just too difficult. Additionally, Congress could not create or support a national currency. And so this once again led to economic problems. You basically had 13 individual states once again that had their own type of currency. So imagine in Washington we had the Washington dollar, and then in Oregon they had the Oregon dollar, and then in California the California dollar. It was really difficult to get any type of interstate trade going on because there were these different forms of currency. There was no national currency. The federal government could print their own money, but it wasn't necessarily accepted by the states. So once again, it would be worthless. Congress could not enforce laws and had no national court system. So there was no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. There was no president of an executive branch. There was a president of the Congress, but like I said, the Congress couldn't do anything. So this president really could not do anything. So there was no way to enforce the law like there is today with the executive branch. And there were no court systems to really settle disputes between states. And so these matters, really, whenever a matter would arise between citizens of a state or between two states, there was no real way to settle it. Congress could not regulate trade. Once again, this is a severe economic problem. Congress could not raise an army. This would be a political problem, and this would be really seen with what is referred to as Shays' Rebellion, which is an uprising, a military uprising from former soldiers of the Revolutionary War that were upset over not being paid back their debts because the government couldn't raise money essentially to pay back their debts. And so essentially the construction of the federal government and the powers delegated to the federal government were really weak. And this is what the weaknesses were pretty much listed out. And like I said, they led to these weaknesses would lead to severe economic and political issues. So why did the founding fathers make the Articles of Confederation so weak? It's easy to look back in hindsight and see the problems that could arise. But when you think about it historically, what the founding fathers were breaking away from or what they were trying to get away from, it makes sense that they would make a central government, this new government, it makes sense that they would make it weak. So what the AOC, that stands for Articles of Confederation, by the way. So what the authors of the Articles of Confederation disliked, taxation without representation. And so they took this power away from Congress. They didn't like that a parliament all the way in Britain could tax them over here in the Americas, especially because they didn't have representation in the Congress. So even though they did have representation in the Congress that they established here in the United States, they still didn't like that this central government could tax. And so they decided that they were not going to give the central government that authority. They didn't like a large central government with absolute authority, like in England with Parliament. Parliament was a very powerful federal government or central government. So it makes sense that, well, this is what we want to break away from. This is what we have an issue with. It's this strong central government that is abusing our rights. So it makes sense that they would create a weak central government. They didn't like having to follow British legislation, once again, coming from a faraway place. So that's why they said states should have their own power. It's more local states, the more local the government, the idea is the more responsive they are to the people. So it's difficult for Washington, D.C. to know what atmosphere and conditions are like here all the way on the West Coast in Washington State. And so the Washington State local government is more responsive to our needs. This was the idea for why they wanted to create such a weak central government. They didn't like a monarch with near or absolute power. They didn't like that the king had a bunch of authority at his hands. And so they created a government that had no executive. There was no executive branch and there was no national court system. And then lastly, they didn't like that the king could change laws at any time. So in order to have any amendment changed, like I've said before, you would need to have all 13 states agree to approve an additional amendment. If you wanted to just pass a simple law, not an amendment, it would require 9 out of 13 states. But still, this was quite a difficult threshold to achieve. So not much legislation and no new amendments were ever passed under the Articles of Confederation. So it led to quite a few problems. Like I said, mostly they're political and economic problems. Difficulty in raising money. This is an economic problem. The federal government, like we've discussed, it could not enforce their own laws. Each state had their own laws, so it was difficulty acting in unison. It was also really difficult to get any type of national economy started because the states weren't necessarily working with each other. They were more focused independently on their own states, and so we couldn't get this national economy to kind of get started. Because there was no executive branch, Congress had difficulty controlling borders, and because there was difficulty controlling borders, there was no real way to settle disputes that would arise from these border conflicts. The requirement of 13 states, like we've said, it led to 0 new amendments being passed. There was no way to control trade across states. And so it wasn't long until the political leaders realized that, okay, this structure of government that we have under the Articles of Confederation is not working, and there need to be some changes. And in 1786, there was a convention that was held in Annapolis, Maryland, but almost nobody really showed up. There were only about 5 states that had any representatives show up. The state in which it was held, Maryland, didn't even send any delegates. And so it really was kind of a failure, this first attempt at changing the Articles of Confederation or tweaking the Articles of Confederation to combat the weaknesses that became apparent was really quite a failure. And what really got people to finally agree that, okay, we need to seriously think about and consider how we are going to change the Articles of Confederation is what is referred to as, or known as, I should say, Shays' Rebellion. So what Shays' Rebellion was, it was an uprising or an insurrection, you can say, of soldiers that were in debt and that were having their homes and farms foreclosed on because they couldn't pay the debts. They were expecting to be paid from the federal government due to their service in the Revolutionary War. But under the Articles of Confederation, like I've said, the federal government could not raise taxes. And so because it could not raise taxes, it had no way of paying these farmers or these soldiers the money that they were rightfully owed from the Revolutionary War. Additionally, on top of that, you had states creating their own taxes. So they would become even more indebted to their own state. So Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran who was owed money, like I said, along with thousands of other farmers, and they had no way of getting that money. So Shays and about 1,200 other farmers, what they ended up doing was rising up and shutting down courts in protest, and they tried to storm the Springfield Armory. The reason why they shut down the courts was because if they shut down the courts and the courts couldn't be in process, then the courts could not legally foreclose on their farms. And so this is the way that they basically stopped their farms from being foreclosed on, was that they just shut down the courts. So as this incident arose, the federal government had no power to put down the rebellion. It couldn't really raise a military force under the Articles to put it down, and they couldn't raise an army to combat this insurrection. And so eventually what ends up happening is that it's put down by a privately funded militia by the governor and businessmen. And so think about if there was this type of insurrection today, it was basically, it was as if like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates put together money to form a private militia and then put down the insurrection. And so this really kind of made it apparent, especially to the wealthier individuals in the United States who were worried that their property could be taken from them by this, what they viewed as a mob. This was what really convinced people that, okay, we need to form a government that has much more authority to it, because the weakness of this central government cannot respond to serious issues that are arising. And if we continue to go down this path, eventually the governmental system will collapse because it simply is not strong enough. Oops. So what Shays Rebellion eventually leads to is the Annapolis, the Annapolis Convention formed in 1786. They like I said, they didn't get anything done. Pretty soon thereafterwards, between 1786 and 1787, is when Shays Rebellion occurs. And like I said, Shays Rebellion is really the tipping point where the political leaders do come to the consensus, okay, something must be done. And so what ends up occurring in 1787 in Philadelphia is what is referred to as the Constitutional Convention, where they wouldn't just tweak the Articles of Confederation, they would come up with a brand new structure of government. So that is where we are going to end today.